The polls have been favoring Vice President Kamala Harris for some time, but a recently released shock poll is more devastating than anything we have seen to Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans because it shows that Harris is now beating Trump in the most important area for Republicans in this election, and we have to talk about it. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we do have a couple of clips to show you in this video of a Fox News debate on the economy, and that's really what this is about, the economy. But before we get to the clips, the bigger news by far is this recently released shock poll from the Financial Times showing that Vice President Harris is beating Donald Trump on the economy. She has been dominating Trump in terms of general election polls. She has overtaken him in the national lead. She's generally speaking beating him in swing states. All of that is profoundly important. But she has effectively erased, according to this poll from the reputable Financial Times, Donald Trump's advantage, his lead on the economy, which is arguably the most important individual area of policy to every American in this country, to most Americans. And she's not only gaining on him, she has surpassed him. If this trend continues, she will undoubtedly win the election. So more on this poll. Yashar Ali points out in the new Financial Times poll, Vice President Harris is now leading Donald Trump by 1 point on who voters trust more with the economy. This same poll, conducted last month when President Biden was still in the race, showed Biden trailing Trump. Since Biden dropped out, Harris has gained 7 points in this poll. Go into more detail. Kamala Harris is more trusted than Donald Trump on the U.S. economy. FT Michigan Ross poll shows Democratic candidate leading on the issue for the first time in nearly a year. More Americans trust Kamala Harris to handle the U.S. economy than Donald Trump, according to a new poll that marks a sharp change in voter sentiment following President Biden's withdrawal from the White House race. The survey, conducted for the Financial Times and the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, is the first monthly poll to show the Democratic presidential candidate leading Trump in the economy since it began tracking voter sentiment on the issue nearly a year ago. Although 41% of Americans still trust Donald Trump more on economic issues, unchanged from the two previous monthly polls, the survey found 42%, so one more percentage point, believes that Vice President Harris would be better at handling the economy. That is a 7 percentage point increase compared to the President Biden's numbers last month. Quote, the fact that voters were more positive on Harris than on Biden says as much about how Biden was doing as it does about how well Harris is doing, said Eric Gordon, a professor at the university. Oof. Okay. As another person put it on Twitter, voters trusting the Democratic candidate more on the economy is a 5-alarm fire for Republicans. And indeed it is. People are talking about this. This thing has gone viral. It's staggering. We've talked about this before, folks. To the extent that political leadership matters in managing a national economy, and it does to some extent, but probably not nearly to the same extent that a lot of people think, right? Presidents just tend to get the credit or the blame. And you have to really parse through, if we're being really honest, to see what they did specifically to contribute to a positive economy or an economic economy. Now, I would argue, a negative economy. I think you could easily make the case that the actions of the Biden-Harris administration has overall led to a positive net effect on the economy. We can track their policies and what they did specifically. But to the extent that, there is a relationship between the economy and political leadership, the macroeconomic metrics generally perform better when Democrats are in charge. But as I've mentioned, the polling advantage for decades has been squarely with the Republicans. Republicans have enjoyed for decades, particularly since the Reagan era, a perception advantage on the economy. So for this poll to be what it is stunning. Now, it's one poll, no matter how reputable, and it's 3 months before the election. But if this trend continues, if it maintains, then between all the other factors, the vice president will almost certainly win the election. So this has to be freaking Trump out. They should be taking it very seriously, in addition to all the other issues that their campaign faces, because this shows that they are still vulnerable on their most important policy issue. I mean, if you rank voter priorities, poll after poll after poll shows that the economy is always either number one or number two. So Republicans enjoying a perception advantage on this is huge. And the fact that they are vulnerable on this, and this poll, as a matter of fact, the Democrats are leading on perception of economic management. That is terrifying for Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans, which means it's good for the rest of us. Now, I want to show you a couple of clips, speaking of the economy. So Fox News Sunday recently hosted a debate between a financial analyst affiliated with the Obama administration and a member of the Heritage Foundation. I want to play you some of the clips from the financial analyst and Fox News contributor, Peter Wolf or Richard Wolf, I can't remember exactly. He was the one, Robert Wolf, I think it is. He makes some really, really good points as a Fox News contributor and financial analyst to a Fox News viewership that might not otherwise hear it.
Let's talk about what the data says this week about what we saw. I want to start with this from USA Today. USA employers added just 114,000 jobs last month, well below expectations for 175,000 gains. Unemployment rose 4.1% up to 4.3. That's the highest in nearly 3 years. They go on to say that one gauge tracking the rise of unemployment signals the U.S. could already be in a recession. Hiring is dipped below pre-COVID levels. Meanwhile, manufacturing activity shrank in July, falling to an 8-month low. Consumer spending, the economy's main engine, is slowing, and credit card debt is at a record high. Robert, that does not sound like a good collection of information.
Well, Shannon, thanks for having me on. And I know we're going to discuss a lot of those points. I would probably flip it completely. We've had 43 consecutive months of jobs growth. And to be clear, over the last 2 years, the Trump team and even EJ from the Heritage Foundation was working on Project 2025, and now they're sprinting away from it. The Biden-Harris administration, as you know, they passed the infrastructure policy. And look what we've done. We've had manufacturing gains over almost 800,000, big private sector investment, and factory construction at record highs. And don't take my word, just look at the projects: the Arizona chips plant, the Georgia battery plant, the North Carolina semiconductor plant, Wisconsin data center. Yes, last month was below expectations, but we've had 14 million job gains since this president has been in office. And we also know that we've had better GDP, we've had better economic policy, and yes, inflation has been a long tail problem for the country, but that's a global phenomenon, both on agriculture and energy.
And he's right. Robert Wolf is a very good surrogate for these things because, of course, Fox wants to emphasize, any potential negativity in the economy. And the economy is not perfect, right? Inflation has gone down, but prices remain high as well. Credit card debt has also increased. There's no doubt about these things. But when you're talking about the major macroeconomic metrics, things are just generally speaking better under the Biden administration than the Trump administration. A couple things to emphasize again. Fact checks. Under Donald Trump, even excluding the impact of the COVID pandemic, the economy generated an average of 182,000 jobs per month when Trump was president, even grading him on a curve for COVID, not holding COVID against him. That's well below President Biden's 277,000 a month, which excludes his post-pandemic bounce, excluding his post-pandemic bounce. Manufacturing is higher under President Biden than it ever was under Donald Trump. Under Donald Trump, we saw a mass exodus of manufacturing jobs in the United States. President Biden has not only regained, basically balanced out, he has increased. There is more manufacturing in the United States domestically than there ever was under Donald Trump. And there are other macroeconomic metrics as well. Again, GDP growth, which is probably the single most important macroeconomic metric because it talks about the total economic activity in a nation. GDP growth was higher under President Biden than Donald Trump. Donald Trump promised, I think it was 6% GDP growth, right? It was only 2.6, right? I mean, he just failed again and again and again by comparison to President Biden. Energy independence is something you hear from MAGA Republicans all the time, but we are actually a net exporter of petroleum and oil under President Biden. Energy production under President Biden, not just in terms of green energy, which is profoundly important. President Biden deserves credit for the transitions that have been made into renewable energy. But even in terms of fossil fuels, we are drilling and fracking and producing more in that sector than we ever did under Donald Trump as well. One more clip to show you of the conversation in which, again, Robert Wolf pushes back pretty hard on some of the negativity coming from the Fox propaganda network.
I mean, listen, we saw the stock market get hit and the world was concerned. But in 1987, I was at Salomon Brothers. We saw the Black Monday crash, and you saw what happened the last few days. One, the stock market came back. And we should be clear, that was a 1,000-point swing, and it was a big swing. We had 2,000-point downturns under President Trump, the three largest in history. I would also say the idea that the Heritage Foundation is also fiscal conservatives all of a sudden, I mean, come on, that's complete BS. They were touting the Trump tax cuts and that it was going to pay for itself with 5% GDP. My buddy Steve Moore couldn't wait to talk about it paying for himself. They had $8 trillion in debt in a 4-year period, the most in the history of a president. Went from 20 to 28 trillion, and the deficit ballooned. So this idea that all of a sudden Heritage is worried about fiscal conservatism, we should just reflect on what really happened during the Trump administration.
Okay.
Phenomenal points again by Mr. Wolf there. It's true. I mean, this is, we've pointed this out before, but the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the tax cut, the Trump tax cuts, that was one of the very few legislative accomplishments of the Trump administration. And the fact of the matter is that the lion's share of the tax relief went to the people who need it the least. It's very true. And by the way, it also added $2 trillion to the debt, a debt that, by the way, that Trump said that not only would he not add to, that he would eliminate the debt he inherited, wouldn't add to any of the debt, and he would wipe out the debt that he inherited from previous administrations. And even if you factor in COVID, Trump spent twice as much. He added twice as much to the debt as President Biden. You count for COVID, it's still twice for both of these men, right? So you take the American Rescue Plan, which was President Biden's first round of COVID relief, third round total because 2 COVID stimulus bills were passed under Trump. You take that away, it's still half. It doesn't matter however you slice it. In terms of adding to the debt, Trump added more to the national debt than President Biden ever has. And I would argue that President Biden's spending priorities were simply much better. That's where we are, folks. The facts, again, have squarely favored Democratic administrations for decades, and certainly even now under the Biden administration. I understand people are upset about inflation and high prices. There's no question about these things. But the facts of the macroeconomic reality is that the Biden administration has just had a better economy than the Trump administration. And the fact that Trump is now losing in this poll, which may be an outlier, and the trend may not continue, but it shows that he is vulnerable on the most important issue to Americans and on the issue I expect, the policy area that Republicans have taken for granted that they would always enjoy an advantage on. They're vulnerable on it. And the Harris campaign should pounce and relentlessly hammer away, and it should be considered a 5-alarm fire for the Trump campaign. Let me know what you think in the comments.